Ed, welcome to the CALU Journal Club meeting number 4. I think this would be like number 38 if it was in the clinical athlete time. But CALU Journal Club number 4. We have, like I said, my name is Quinn Hennick, and Shelby is going to be my co-facilitator tonight. And we're going to have some awesome discussions about walking and low back pain and exercise. So if you are curious about these meetings, we've kind of spawned them off of a smart guy named Benjamin Franklin, who way back in the day started a weekly club. It was called the Junto Club. And for them, it was a mutual improvement club and basically a room full of really smart people discussing topics and key issues of the day. So kind of like this, they had an important policy. That policy was that all discussions would be conducted in a sincere spirit of inquiry after truth, without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. So we're all on the same team. We're just out here trying to be less wrong, but we do encourage discussion. So that's how we push the brain gains forward. So tonight's topic is the effectiveness of walking versus exercise on pain and function in chronic low back pain, and specifically discussing a systematic review and meta-analysis on that topic. Just to get a quick feel for the room, Megan has created a poll for us. And if that popped up in front of your face, give it a quick click. Are you a clinician, a student clinician, a coach trainer, or a student coach trainer? Just to kind of get an idea of the crew tonight. Looks like we got a lot of clinicians, student clinicians, a couple coaches and student coaches. Awesome. So I'll show you guys that breakdown. Pow. Okay. So the paper, like I said, the effectiveness, and you can download it from that link, effectiveness of walking versus exercise on pain function in chronic low back pain, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. So the question was kind of the introduction was, chronic low back pain is definitely a burden on the healthcare system. And we're still kind of struggling to figure out how to treat it. And it was kind of the idea here is that a lot of things can seem to have an effect, various exercise modalities and these types of things. And then they go on to just kind of talk about the importance of physical activity for health in general. But in terms of just walking, because walking would be just a really nice, low cost, low barrier to entry suggestion intervention for somebody who, otherwise has barriers to kind of a rigid, more structured exercise regimen. And so that was kind of the author's idea behind the paper, is that there's not a whole lot on, say, a walking program versus other exercise programs. So that was the point of the paper, was to determine the effectiveness of walking interventions compared to other forms of physical exercise on pain and disability, quality of life, fear avoidance in individuals with chronic low back pain. So, Shelby, what do you think about this paper?
I thought it was interesting. I think after I read it, the very last sentence in the limitations made me ask, well, was this even like a good paper? The sentence on when there are a few studies, the power of the test is too low to distinguish chance from real asymmetry. And so just kind of hitting on the point of, we don't really know to what extent the shifts on those forest plots are super accurate versus just up to chance. At the very least, it appeared that walking didn't harm, I guess, a lot of these people. We just don't know if it had an added benefit. I guess for people that don't have access to a gym and want to walk, it's at least a starting point. So yeah, I kind of got to the end of the paper and was kind of like, okay, so what do we do with this?
Right. And also for anybody, feel free to jump in, chime in, whenever you want. But that's a really good point. So it was interesting. There was only 5 studies included in the entire systematic review and meta-analysis. Now, all 5 were included in the meta-analysis, but I think it would be confusing because when you read through the results, the effect sizes for all of those outcome measures that were talked about, pain, disability, quality of life, other outcome that they were looking at based on whatever the studies looked at, the effect sizes were really small.
Mhm.
But when you look at one of the tables, it was table 1, and I have to cock my head because they put the table long ways. But in table 1, when you look at the reported results on just the right side of the table, there were significant findings, statistically significant findings in all of the studies pretty much. And it was, yeah, walking helped, or walking had statistically significant results, the same as exercise, the same as all the interventions. But that's where we get into this idea of statistically significant, simply meaning that there was a low probability that the data that they had was by chance, based on the arbitrary p-value, which is usually 0.05. But that's much different than a clinically relevant change or difference. And I think that's what you were kind of getting at, Shelby, was there was really no difference between exercise and walking, and the effects kind of overall were really small. But there was not a net negative, it didn't seem, no matter what. So like you said, maybe it's just another option as an entry point to getting somebody moving around and that type of thing.
Yeah, I think it would have been interesting to see like walking versus just going about your normal life.
Yeah, there wasn't the control groups.
It
They
wasn't
weren't.
a true control. I feel like they were all doing something.
Yeah. So it did seem like that. Like there was an intervention for all of the groups. So Chris says a classic A versus A plus B studies get messy. And because you haven't really dialed in what the A and the B do by themselves yet, and then you tack on something else, and then you combine them, and so you're just like introducing more noise.
And they also, the B wasn't consistent. So I think they put this in the limitations as well, that the details of the exercise intervention weren't included. And that's a whole other issue. And I think they even addressed that there was the probability of under and overdosing people, and that led to probably a smaller effect size.
Yeah. And we talk about we're trying to treat like chronic issues, and they define chronic as over 3 months, and that's usually kind of the arbitrary cut point that you'll find. But I didn't see it as far as we would have to pull the individual studies, but the length of time of symptoms that the participants were experiencing, a lot of times there's a big range. So anywhere from that 3 months cut off to like years. So how with these studies, they're all like 6 weeks, 8 weeks, trying to intervene on something that somebody's been experiencing for potentially many, many more months and potentially years. It's hard to pull from that. So you see these like things that are trending towards that. And maybe it was just the studies just aren't long enough. And this is kind of the nature of doing these types of things.
Quinn, one thing that I wanted to point out from one of the table 1, right? If you read through all the reported results, and this is again probably 3 levels deeper than some of the errors I think on the front end. I mean, one of the studies, the Pedro score was a 4 out of 10 of the 5. So I mean, how comfortable are you with that study being lumped into only an N of 5 studies? Now the sample was fairly high, I believe, in some of the studies, but to my point is like it says, there's no significant differences in pain and disability between groups. And that was pretty much in every one of the studies, but then some of them report, improvements in all outcome measures. But the outcome measures, if you go down to, let me see what page it is. It's the 3rd sentence or 2nd sentence in the discussion. It's like, walking is not inferior, but then the start of the next paragraph is, even though MCIDs were reached only in a few of the cases. So we're saying that there's a difference, but it wasn't even reaching our minimal clinical detectables.
Well, you look at table 5 and you can see that down the line. Right. Yeah. Not attained. So the MCID, not attained, attained, a couple attained sprinkled in. And then in some cases, even the control group attained the MCID, right, and then the treatment group didn't. So, you're right. Again, I don't know if these short-term studies that are trying to make a dent or trying to kind of operationally define treatment for a long-term, undefined, literally non-specific low back pain, it's just really hard.
Well, that was my other question, is how did everybody feel about the criteria of low back pain? Because it was chronic low back pain defined strictly based on, right? So if you read, it's page 623, types and participants, right? Had to be symptomatic adults with a diagnosis of CLBP, right? Chronic low back pain, characterized as chronic, more than 3 months.
Yeah.
I mean,
I was
that's a
surprised.
lot.
So I was surprised they only had 5 studies. Like, when I was reading that
Yeah.
inclusion criteria, as broad as I felt that it was, as I was reading it, I was surprised that only 5 studies kind of made it through that filtering process, which maybe just a walking intervention is kind of the rate limiter there, as far as it just hasn't been looked at very often compared to, and in a randomized controlled trial.
Right. Well, in all these studies too, you want to look at interpersonal changes too. What if the individuals were already walking as an exercise? I mean, we don't know where the baseline for some of these individuals, as in what was their baseline activity level. If I've got low back pain for 3 months and one of the things that I do for exercise is walk, an intervention of more walking may not change my symptoms or perception of my symptoms, right?
Alex said she'd like to see a little more stratification with benchmarks for chronic low back pain. Alex, what would you, I don't disagree. What would be examples of what you'd like to see kind of parsed out there?
I guess, I mean, in my very limited knowledge base, but directional preference, sure. Or just like kind of, Chris, what you're alluding to, like, what is their benchmark of activity? So is this someone who's already a highly active individual with chronic low back pain, or is this a sedentary individual with chronic low back pain? And what did the onset look like? I mean, there's so many ways I think that could have been done differently to at least give me, if I were to use this clinically, give me a better understanding of who am I actually thinking about this for? Because right now, I don't think that I'm any better at making a decision about a specific patient, other than that walking isn't going to hurt them and exercise might help them, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. I think it's tough, without having the authors here, that we can kind of talk about, why they chose the inclusion criteria they did. But I would say if there's not really other papers on a particular topic, sometimes it can be beneficial to start broad, and then the expectation is maybe this group or another research group then says, okay, we can take this kind of broadband, and now we've got some direction to make it the resolution a little bit more fine, and start subgrouping people and those types of things. Because if you get too specific right away, you don't even know what the question is really, and then it's like, oh, we have to zoom out. So that, I think that's points well taken, and probably the direction that this line of research, if it's going to continue, is going to head, I would imagine.
So to get to the point of not having the true control, or like the not having somebody that just goes about their life, usually the reason for that is because to try to get through an IRB nowadays, in order for you to say I'm not going to do anything, we already know exercise is good.
Yeah.
So you have to not give a treatment that is somewhat good is hard to get through an IRB. That's why it's really hard to get through a true control. So a lot of people give at least exercise as that control group. And I think the other important point to make there is that exercise didn't do better than walking in any of these trials. And to get to the MCID point too, remember it's between group here, right? So like there's a difference between within group MCID and between group MCID.
That's a good point. And I didn't pull the individual studies to see the within group change. Which
I mean,
go ahead.
okay.
Sorry.
Well, I was just, I mean, the thing for me too, and those are good points, Geronimo. I mean, I think that's a really good point to make about IRB and the difficulties in research in general, right? Like, I don't know how many people here have done that, and trying to get through anything through an IRB is, it's an experience, needless to say. So, but yeah, I mean, I think if there's going to be an A versus A plus B study, we have to just be really, I mean, to your point, we just need to really be specific about what those characteristics are, or there's so much variability that the likelihood of finding a difference by chance goes up is what all I was thinking of. But but those are good points. I mean, I think I was trying to look up a few papers. I thought, I know I've got a few somewhere floating around my desktop about walking and low back pain. And there's been some really good evidence to show that walking is effective. So I think potentially it may have been beneficial for them to reference that maybe in the discussion to say, hey, we know that walking has been shown based on these kind of, the robustness of the data in these areas. I just didn't read that. So that was my thought.
Well, and that is like the studies that are included in the systematic review are subject to the inclusion criteria. So this is not to say that there's only 5 studies on walking and for low back pain. There's 5 studies that they found versus exercise or combined with exercise versus exercise modalities that were randomized controlled trials in chronic low back pain as they defined it. And so when you get through all of these layers, and then these are the studies you pull, but you're right. So, anybody listening, there could be a whole nother line of research that just didn't happen to be included in this particular. This is not a systematic review on all studies that included walking as an intervention for low back pain. But it's not necessarily a negative here. So I see this as somewhat similar to the paper on low versus high resistance training in osteoarthritis population that was posted in the CALU group and has been making its rounds in the media, which is a game of telephone. But this is not to say that these interventions didn't have an effect. They all had an effect. The effect might be small, but you could spin it to where it's like, okay, we have options. So if this person just doesn't want to be participating in a kind of a rigid exercise program, and that's just not what they do, and the adherence is likely going to be really low, you can have that conversation. Well, do you like walking? You can walk with your kids or your dog or your grandkids, or you start having that conversation too. Just getting them up and moving might do something. It was kind of like what Alex was saying earlier. So we can look at these papers and say, well, what do we do? Or we could also say, well, it's good that we have starting points that can be general. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that gets to the point that we made earlier too, Quinn, about where your entry point is, right? Like chronic low back pain does not, to me, give me an indication of the irritability, the sensitivity, the severity of said. I mean, just the duration of your symptoms. I don't necessarily believe truly identifies the type of symptom or the experience that you're having. I mean, again, right, like walking may be a very appropriate intervention for somebody a week, into some kind of non-specific or whatever term you want to use for a highly irritable, highly sensitized low back pain. Like, yeah, walking may be a great intervention for that. Whereas if you've got this mumbly, grumbly low back pain that's like a 2 or a 3, that's, somewhere on the oswestry that's a little higher than normal, but still existing, then walking may be too low of an intervention. So I think back to my point, it's like the entry point is ultimately dictated by the status and kind of the milestone at which you are currently. And they identified these people as just having a duration of low back pain, not a severity or a type. I'm like, when my back gets grumbly right now, I'd go do a bunch of like reverse hypers and like Tabata, like hyper holds, and my back feels money in like 15 minutes. But that, again, that's because that back pain is a lot different than potentially what they recruited based on the studies and identification, is my thought.
I'm not sure I've ever seen a study stratify like that though. Like I've seen people try to do directional preference, and I've seen prior to that, try to do like the whole facet disc, whatever, and that didn't work out for them. But and the typical stratification now is through psychosocial, right? So stratified through StartBack is the hot topic right now. But I've never seen them try to stratify, I guess, between what he's like physically active is would be like
you would have to come up with like a frame and some kind of spectrum of like oswestry or pain disability or function, or pick a thing and do that. I mean, I think it's a good point. This goes all the way back into the fundamental question of what is low back pain and how good are we at defining, identifying, and diagnosing low back pain. I mean, if we want to chase the rabbit that far, then we could spend the next 2 weeks on Journal Club. I'm sure, as everybody would have some pretty interesting narratives, depending on what you've been taught, what you've learned, how you interpret low back pain. So that's why I think, I don't know that I would go the diagnostic route as much as I would find some better qualifiers, as if there's like a range of ODI or oswestry, whatever you want to use, but at least narrow it to, you have to have symptoms for 3 months, and then your oswestry is X to X, and we lump that group, and then X to X, we lump that group, or, you know, whatever other functional device or outcome you would want to use is that was my thought.
Maybe even self-reported physical activity, like
Sure.
weekly, like even a 0 versus a self-reported of three plus exercise sessions a week or something, to try to polarize it. Jessica, you're on. You can unmute yourself, or maybe I have to do it.
I got it.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering, just in general, thinking of how everyone in all these studies are getting better. I wonder how much, like just the idea of like a person taking control of their low back pain, thinking, okay, I'm going to be part of this study. And then they're getting the advice from a physical therapist that either walking or the exercises are actually potentially going to help. And maybe before that they were afraid to do these things because of the pain. And so like all these kind of psychosocial factors contributing to them getting better, because they're like, oh, actually, even though I'm in like a little bit of pain, that fear avoidance has gone down, maybe something like that. That was my thought.
No, I think that's a great point. I think that's probably a big part of what all of these kind of exercise interventions do for this population. But you bring up a good point about even just like knowing that you're in a science study, like, oh, you know, and you're part of this thing. And like you said, you're doing stuff that you haven't maybe been doing. And yeah, that's interesting. A contextual factors from just being in the study itself. Like you can't blind somebody. It's hard enough to blind them within a group, but you can't blind them for being in the study. That's like the informed consent process. So no, that's just a really interesting observation. Those are the things that are probably so powerful that we know are there. It's just so hard to measure and define and then study, you know. But
You got to look at the advertisement for the study too. So like 2 days ago or something like that, there was a study that came out, and it was an app-based exercise program for OA versus education and exercise for OA. So like a control group that we know is pretty good, right? Like education and exercise is good for OA, and the app did better between groups. So like 1.5 between group. And I'm like, that's crazy, because that means that like that's like a 3-point if it was, you know, if you just looked at within group within the app, considering like education and exercise. And I'm like, so I asked the authors, I was like, how did you guys advertise this? And it was like, we advertised this new app that you want to join. So imagine if you signed up for an app and then you got, I have to come into see a PT actually for 3 months or whatever. You know, like that is a contextual factor right there, because you were expecting something and then you got something else because you got randomized into the control group.
That's really interesting. Like all the books have you read all those books, Geronimo? Those books behind you?
Dude, no, there's a picture. It's like a.
I know, man. I saw you put it up. It's impressive though. I'm just scrolling through the comments here. But yeah, Jessica, that's a super interesting point. Michelle, we mentioned she'd be interested. Yeah, go ahead.
Which also points to the fact of how much power we have as PTs. I think also when people are coming in with things like chronic pain, and just to like be aware of that kind of, I mean, maybe that's extrapolating a lot.
No, the entire experience, right? You know, think about if we've ever gone to the doctor's office. It's like the minute you walk in the door, it's a whole experience for the patient, you know, from start to finish, every interaction, the walls, everything that's said. So I think you're bringing up great points. Tony says in the chat, if we only look at this study based on table 5, is neither walking or exercise very effective because only a few outcomes reached the MCIDs. Yeah, that's the difference in my estimation between being statistically significant, because I do believe that they most of the studies, if not all of them, had statistically significant findings, meaning that, okay, this data is probably not due to chance. That's different than the effect being large enough to be clinically meaningful. But I'll kind of go just back to the study design or the length of the studies, the 6 to 8 week studies. Again, trying to treat potentially chronic issues. So, maybe the data is running towards, as we say, like running towards the MCIDs. And if we just ran the study longer, we'd see that, or it's running away. And if we ran the study longer, we'd see it just kind of wash out. Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Jessica brought up a really solid point about and we've been kind of dancing around this for the past 5 minutes now about the strength of contextual factors, right? I guess I'm always kind of just naturally skeptical. Maybe that's just my bias, but anytime there's a big systematic review, meta-analysis, or RCT studying chronic issues, I'm sure a bunch of us who've had clinical experience working with this population knows there's just a giant range of variability and individuality. And I guess one of the fundamental assumptions of an RCT is that you're assuming that the intervention group and the control group are the same, right? So you do an intervention on somebody, and because they're the same group, you can say that, hey, this intervention had a certain effect. But with that, just kind of intuitively, just that much variability, for some patient, walking might be the activity they want to get back to doing. So if you can get them to walk just a little bit, it's just an automatic improvement. ODI goes down 30 points or something like that. Whereas for someone else, it might not be anything at all. It's what am I even doing, wasting time right now? So even though you're doing the same thing, the effect might be, very, very different. So I don't know, I guess what I'm trying to say is, and we don't have to go down this rabbit hole, all the way if we don't want, but just kind of the fundamental, I guess, this presumption of doing these types of studies on this population. I feel a lot of times I gain much more clinical insight just from reading a case study of one, what worked for one particular patient. Here are all the things that the clinician dealt with in the history throughout the intervention, kind of like that. I hope that kind of made sense.
Yeah, Jay, I just don't want to be the one always saying all the things. If anybody else has thoughts on that or anything?
I mean, yeah, I think it goes right back to what we were talking about earlier, Jay, is until the groups are homogenous, well, then the amount of heterogeneity in the groups themselves, right, going all the way back to the methodology of the studies themselves, obviously that just trickles down into the error and the variability of the outcomes of the studies. Right? If you took a bunch of people with back pain ranging from 3 months to 3 years with, a variety of types of back pain, however you want to describe it, and a variety of performance indicators, right, or capacities, and you shove them all into the same study, then yeah, the more heterogeneity that goes in, the more that comes out typically, right? And then you're left, but again, as a researcher, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Either you make a very reasonable clinical study, that is, I'm going to take a group of people that I'm just grabbing out of the community that should represent the general public and how they present, or I'm exceptionally narrow in my focus in creating a very homogeneous sample so I can really be particular and constrain the study as much as possible. And then you get this nice output that says, well, unless you meet all of these criteria that I did the study on, then the intervention or the outcome really doesn't apply to you. So I think it's just a very good research question. I know a lot of researchers now are moving more towards allowing for less constraint or more variability and speaking to those limitations in their studies, because yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. The less technical we are on the front end, certainly the less on the back end. If we're not controlling for any of these other variables about what they perceive is going on. To Geronimo's point, like what were they told? How were they told? If you guys got a chance to listen to Dan Cobian last night on the Casual Chats little podcast that we did for the SIG, the performance SIG, it's the same thing, right? Like it matters what you tell people. If you're trying to perform a task and you tell them to do it a certain way, as in, I just want you to walk from this point and go sit in that chair, versus I want you to go from this point and sit in that chair as fast as possible because I'm timing you. And you can't expect the first group to do it quickly or with any kind of intention because you didn't tell them that you were timing them. It's the same task and technically the same measurement, right? The chair, the line, the distance, the stopwatch, but you just didn't tell them they were being timed. And so I think all of that goes into the contextual factors that you guys are speaking about. And but how do you control for all of them? And how do you do research on that? I know there's a long-winded answer, but that's just kind of, I think the way that I try to compartmentalize that stuff.
I think it's important too. You mentioned how hard it is to recruit for subgroups, right? So because then you have to power for the subgroup. Now you're not even powering for that. You have to power for the subgroup, which is impossible. Like we have not done it in MSK. Like literally, we cannot do it in MSK because we cannot recruit that many people.
Jay brings up a good point though, about the case studies. I find it, so research a lot of times is on the average, right? So we're looking at average effects. High intensity resistance training on average increases maximal force production, these types of things. But when you zoom into the individual, you see the variation, and that's with any of this stuff. So now I do find it useful as a very zoomed out kind of view here, which I see this particular systematic review providing us this very zoomed out view, that there are a lot of things that can potentially start moving the needle in the right direction. When we start zooming in, then, these are the questions that we need to parse down all the way down to the case study, AKA the individual level, where we're literally interacting with this human in front of us and doing things on the daily, adjusting to them, communicating with them. But all of that information is what we're triaging to make decisions. So I think it's all important. That I don't have anywhere else to go with that statement, but just kind of the idea of a paper like this being less or more useful than, let's say, a case study. I think they provide us different things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I guess like one of the things that I guess I'm just starting to come to terms with now is like, I remember going to PT school, taking like a research class, and I'm sure everyone's seen like the pyramid, like the hierarchy of like evidence, right? So, you got, expert opinion on the bottom, then case studies, then your RCTs, what have you, and then culminating with the meta-analysis. And I think I definitely fell into the trap of like, oh, if it's not a meta-analysis, then it's not clinically useful. That was like, I guess, the message that I had like subconsciously almost in my head. And then to your point, Quinn, what you just mentioned, now I'm starting to realize like what kinds of different utility all these different tools have, and especially for like low back pain. So I think an article like this, like a big systematic review, is a good starting point, like maybe asking a very important clinical question, but in terms of deriving some kind of clinical utility, like we've all been kind of saying tonight, that it's not really saying all that much, and there's all these holes we can poke. So maybe there's some merit in like going down to like the case study or the expert opinion level, see what other people are doing with specific cases, and then maybe incorporate it into your own practice that way, and then see what works for some, see what works for others in terms of just pure clinical utility here.
I think those are great discussion points. Bye, Alex. Sorry, she said bye in the chat. Let's go. I think this is a good point to jump into the breakout rooms. We encourage you to stay around. I know people start dropping off. You might be doing stuff and can't participate, and that's fine. I'm going to pop into the chat the prompts that Megan made for us that you can use as discussion points. So this first one is, have you prescribed a walking program for somebody with chronic low back pain before? Specifically, well, let's do it this way and progress from there. And what did that look like? Was it general or was it structured? Second discussion point, did patient preference have anything to do with that prescription? And then thirdly, if you get to it, were the outcomes and the MCIDs surprising to you that we failed to reach those marks in a lot of those papers? And what do you make of that? So we will break out. I'm going to do some quick math. I'm going to do 4 groups. All right, here we go. Okay. We are back. Shelby, what did your group talk about? Uh-oh. Oh, I think maybe Shelby lost connection. Who's got some insights?
We
Oh,
were in the same group. I don't know what happened.
yeah. Take it.
We mostly spent time on the first 2. Actually, we only spent time on the first 2.
That's
And
okay.
we thought, oh, there she is. Great. If I forget anything, just jump in. Yeah, we talked about a lot of people had prescribed walking programs before, and they seem pretty effective, just based on either a time limit or like using a pedometer or something. And coming up with creative ways if the person doesn't feel safe in their environment, to either walk around like their apartment complex, or if they can drive, like drive to the mall or drive to Target and just like walk around in the store or something like that. So we talked about that. What else am I forgetting, Shelby?
We talked
about patient compliance and how it needs to be the right patient if you're gonna like prescribe it and then not see them for a week or 2.
Yeah, and then Matthew also had a good point on just like pacing it, as far as if someone's, sometimes onset at 20 minutes, cut 20% off of that and have them start there. That way they're in control of their pain, and their pain's not controlling them. So I thought that was a good point.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What about the other groups?
I actually just posted this in the chat. Tom, would you? I wanted to hear the rest of your statement when we kind of got cut off, but we had a pretty good discussion going, Quinn, about kind of the how the intervention, right, is obviously dictated by the entry point of our client. And so, Tom, you want to share? Are you cool with sharing a bit?
Yeah, man. So, yeah, we're just talking about how, like you said, the entry point will dictate, where you're going to start there. And with this big study, there would have had presumably a variety of entry points, but then also the not quite an exit point, but their expectations of what their back ought to be able to do. That for some people, going on a walking program is going to build them up to feel like they're not disabled by their back because that's their goal, right? But for others, they're looking to do much more demanding tasks, looking to get back to some heavy strength training or sports, and walking doesn't feel like they're not disabled anymore when they can now walk.
Sorry, Tom, I didn't hear a word you said. I was just too fixated on your accent. Where are you from?
Australia.
Awesome. No, those are great points. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, to piggyback on that too, Quinn, like we were talking, we had a good conversation about credibility. Like if you said, like, hey man, I can barely get out of bed in the morning, I struggle for my day, and I said, hey, let's try to get you moving and let's go for some walks, versus my back only hurts when I'm hitting 85% of my 1RM back squat, and it's only on heavy days that my back hurts, but it's been hurting for 3 months. If you told me like I need to go for some casual 30-minute walks a couple days a week, and I'm like, well, no, I think I can do that, but it's the squatting thing that's killing me. So I think we were just talking about the parity that exists between these groups, and like in the the entry point, to Tom's point, is like where that is and how that intervention is. Walking valuable? I've used it plenty in my career, and that's dictated primarily based on their current function.
Anybody from the other groups? These are great discussion points so far. I think people are scared to follow Tom, his smart points and his amazing accent. It sounds like we have a positive, kind of a positive spin on everything, though, where it's not such a, nothing matters, what do we do, but more so, okay, we've got this thing that tells us we're not going to really screw this up if we do something, but now let's talk about kind of that something. And that's where I think it's really useful to talk in groups like this, to get actual ideas of, what we've done, that when the rubber meets the road, and understanding that each individual is going to be different based on all those factors that you guys are discussing there. Chris wants to hear Tom if he has any more points to add.
Not, not
Okay.
really.
No, they just want you to say, now that's a knife. That's what they want you to say.
That was good, Chris.
Well, I had an Australian friend that I've been to Melbourne quite a few times. It's my most favorite thing to hear in the world is, Crocodile Dundee. I mean, come on, you guys love him too. And don't say you don't, because I've asked a lot of Australians and they do. They like Crocodile Dundee.
Tom, can you confirm?
I can confirm. It's a national treasure.
Okay, before this conversation devolves anymore, anybody have any other thoughts on the topic at all?
I'll add something my group, we talked a lot about regarding kind of patient preferences and stuff. Like we were saying how probably anybody we meet with, we're going to try to get them up towards some of these physical activity guidelines regardless. So maybe they do have more specific goals that are way beyond just walking, but we're going to kind of start with the low hanging fruit. And if they're not anywhere near those minimum activity guidelines, we're going to try to bump them up anyway. And a lot of times certain things just start to clear up on the way, and then we can start to address some of those higher level tasks. But if we're not even just like attempting that, like I just think it's a really good place to start at the very least. So we can talk about non-specific versus specific, but grab that low hanging fruit and then see where you're at after that.
And I think kind of related to that, our group was talking about sort of just KISS principle in general. Like keep it simple. You're thinking about home exercise programs. We're just going back to like, the laundry list effect. And like, it's going to be a whole lot of nothing if you got like anything more than 3 exercises anyway, in terms of just like having this long list of homework to do of exercises that you can't perfectly replicate in your home because you don't have the right equipment or whatever it is. So then it kind of becomes a little more like, specifically for like, upper Midwest or Northeast, when you get into the situation of like having crazy weather, icy sidewalks, then you just got to get a little more creative about how to make it not super mind numbing. If you have an 800 square foot apartment, ways to kind of do more like, maybe you're doing toe taps on a step, or kind of doing some sort of like circuit activity that can be a little bit more fun, or just walking around the apartment complex, if you can, with COVID stuff. So it's kind of that, keeping it simple, making the home exercise program as kind of bare bones as you can, to just make sure that like they have some buy-in and they can kind of like, have a little flexibility, like, hey, walk 10 minutes today, let's see what you actually want to do. So that's kind of what we were talking about. It was really interesting points there.
And to that point, just like something that's been super helpful for me is I work with a fair number of low income folks right now who can't get out and walk where they live. Smart WOD timer is your friend for stuff like this: counter push-ups, split squats, all that good stuff, and just get them on a circuit. And they're like, oh, I can download that on my phone. Okay, let's do it right here in clinic while you're on Wi-Fi. Here, like, let's you set it up right now. Let's you write down a list of exercises you'd want to do at home. And that's a good alternative to walking, because I've got quite a few people right now who can't.
What was that app, Taylor?
Smart WOD. It's an interval timer.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, and to that point, and to Dan's point too, we've been talking about walking specifically because that was the kind of the topic of the paper, but maybe it's more of like what a walking program also represents, which is just kind of, it's low impact exercise. It's exercise that you can kind of increase the bandwidth on, that doesn't have to be super intense, And so like Taylor just listed a bunch of exercises that you can just kind of, you can go at your own pace, but you can, make maybe a list of that subset of exercises that fall into that bucket. And you say, okay, every day or 3 times a week, you're going to pick 2 or 3 exercises from your list. And you're going to make that into a little workout for you, like using that app. So I think that's awesome. Smart WOD. Cool. That's so good. Anything else from anybody?
I just kind of have a quick group question on the discussion on page 629. The second paragraph on the right, it says concerning the clinical wow, I can't speak because it's Friday. Concerning the clinical relevance of the results, a slight superiority appeared for walking on the recovery of function and for exercise on the reduction of fear avoidance beliefs. Sorry, there's like dogs running around my house. I'm very distracted. But as far as like walking versus exercise for recovery of function versus fear avoidance, do y'all feel that that is a like an accurate, I don't know, like dichotomy there, or is that just the effect size is so small, so I don't know if that's fair to even say.
I don't take much stock into it, only because I don't know the number specifically, but we're probably talking about 2 papers out of the 5 that looked at those specific outcomes, because not all the papers looked at fear avoidance or even oswestry or you know what I mean? So they're only going off of like 1 or 2 papers to make those claims. And one of those papers had a really small sample. And so I think with statements like that, it probably helps to say based on our data, XYZ, because that's not a lie,
Right.
but take it with a grain of salt. Like this is not, you can't really extrapolate that, I don't think.
Yeah, it felt like a reach. So that's why I was wanting to to bring that up, because I thought that was interesting that they tried to.
I think it's just noise.
Yeah.
But that's my thought. Anybody else have thoughts on that?
It definitely goes counter to what I would have expected, but I'm with my bias, I'm sort of thinking more of like a strength training intervention, and
right.
I would have expected that to have larger effect sizes on fear avoidance and things like that, if people can successfully strength train as compared to the progression program.
Maybe because it's more progressive in nature, you can kind of like put more incrementally more stress upon it, whereas walking, you can maybe increase distance or speed, but it's maybe not as intense, or even the movements, you get more movement options and things within like a resistance training program. Is that kind of your thought there of why they would be different?
Yeah, just more that I think my expectation would have been that with more varied programs that, feeling that you can pick up something heavy off the floor would give you a bit more confidence in your back compared to just going, oh, well, now I can walk 3 laps and I could only do 1 before. I would have thought it would have more effect on fear avoidance, but I know it's not quite what they maybe studied here.
Anybody have thoughts on that or the last prompt? Isaac was kind of asking if we could touch on that. Tony, do you have something to say?
Yes, I was gonna say, I actually have had a few patients that walking was one of their primary aggravating factors to their persistent low back pain. So I know there's quite a few examples of how is walking gonna develop our confidence in someone with persistent back pain who has it from doing 1 RM deadlifts. Of course, focusing on the training program involved with load management and potentially sort of managing the program related to deadlift might be more important in that regard. But I think it's also really important in terms of what the patient comes in front of you, what is their main aggravating factor. If it is walking, it could be something that is going to be more important than resistance training in that case for the individual patient. So I think that's another important thing of what is the patient coming into you with in terms of what's aggravating and what do they want to do.
And maybe even their jobs, right? Like what if walking is important for their job? So it's not even, oh, let's do walking because it's an enjoyable exercise program for you. No, it's like what you have to walk for your job. So like we have to do that. in some capacity. That's a good point. Isaac asked if we could touch on the last prompt real quick as we close this out. Why, basically, why did we not reach the MCIDs in a lot of these papers with a lot of the outcomes? And for me, I think it maybe goes back to some of the things we've talked about. Shorter term studies, exercise programs that aren't necessarily tailored to the individual or kind of like arbitrarily put together. Or maybe they were, trending towards MCID. So you double the length of the study and maybe you see that, maybe if it's 12 to 16 weeks, maybe you see us or the papers cross that threshold. So those are kind of my thoughts on that. Anybody else have any idea on the lack of clinically important differences?
I think it's a bit of a mix between what you said, the size, the power itself, the duration of the study, and the heterogeneity of the samples, in my opinion. I think those three things could come together and generate all kinds of random stuff. And that, I mean, I'm sure there were some people that met it. That had to have been, obviously, based on the study. So who were those people? What did they look like? That may be the better way to go about this, is get into the studies themselves, look at the people that did meet it, and were there commonalities with those individuals? Like, oh, it turns out the people that met it were the ones that were really low functioning or high pain initially. And they're the ones that made it, is kind of my thought. If you get into I'm sure if you get into the nuances of the intra-individual changes, that there was certainly something in there.
Because we don't know where people started from. So there
Right.
may, we could have some type of a bias where the group is just already high functioning.
Yeah.
But so
yeah,
we want to look at those plots where we're looking, like you said, at the individual. Sometimes even the outliers can pull the means to where the MCIDs maybe weren't crossed from a population perspective.
Yeah.
But quite a few of the individuals did cross that threshold. So that's, to your point, kind of digging into the individual studies to get a better idea of that. But that's still not going to give you more information on the individual, because obviously we don't know who they are.
Yeah.
What was different about them,
Right.
All right. I think this was a good one. I think this is a good place to end, but hopefully you guys got something out of the discussion. I know I did. So I want to thank everybody for being here. Megan just dropped the feedback form in the chat. So all the changes that we've ever made to these meetings are based on your all's feedback of how we can make them better. So click that link and open it before we close out so you don't lose it. And give us whatever feedback you have. And be on the lookout for the vote. We always vote on the topics in the CALU Facebook group. So the next meeting will be on a Monday. And it won't be this Monday, maybe the next Monday, either the next Monday or the Monday after that. I always get those mixed up, but it's going to be a Monday. Yeah, Megan rocks, Shelby rocks, everybody here. Thanks so much for being here. And we will see you on the next one. Have a good weekend. You party people, Friday night. Crazy.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thanks, Quinn. I appreciate it.